there's a specific kind of pause that happens right before opening a banking app. Maybe you've felt it. Your thumb hovers over the icon for half a second longer than it should. Some small part of your brain quietly asks, "Do I really need to know right now?" And more often than people would like to admit, the answer that wins is no, not right now, maybe later. Here's the strange part. This isn't happening because people don't care about their money. Often, it's the exact opposite. The people most anxious about their finances are frequently the ones checking the least. Not because they're careless, but because somewhere along the way, checking stopped feeling like information and started feeling like a threat. If you've ever gone days, weeks, sometimes longer, deliberately not looking at a balance, a credit card statement, or a loan total, you're not broken, and you're not alone. There's an actual name for this pattern, and once you understand why your brain does it, you'll never look at avoidance the same way again. So let's talk about why checking your account can feel so much harder than it should, and what that avoidance is quietly costing you, even when it feels like it's protecting you. Here's the assumption most people carry around without ever saying it out loud. If I don't look, at least I won't have to deal with it yet. It feels like a small, harmless delay, a few extra days before facing a number. But here's what almost nobody examines closely enough. The thing being avoided usually isn't the number itself. It's the feeling that's expected to show up the moment the number is seen. Picture someone who knows their credit card balance has been creeping up. They're not unaware of this. They could probably guess the rough number within a couple $100s if you asked them directly. And yet, they'll go out of their way to avoid actually opening the app and seeing it written in black and white. Why would someone avoid information they already roughly know? Because there's a meaningful difference between suspecting something and confirming it. A suspicion stays soft, vague, easy to push aside. A confirmed number becomes real, undeniable, something that now has to be dealt with, rather than simply worried about in the background. So the brain, trying to protect itself from an uncomfortable feeling, quietly steers a person away from the one action that would actually resolve the uncertainty: looking. This pattern has a name: financial avoidance, sometimes called money avoidance, or, informally, the financial ostrich effect, the tendency to deliberately not seek out information that might confirm a fear. And it shows up far more often, in far more financially capable people than most people realize. Let's break this down, piece by piece, because the mechanics behind this avoidance are more interesting and more fixable than most people expect. Layer 1. Why not knowing feels safer than knowing? Here's a simple way to picture what's actually happening inside the brain in that moment of hesitation. Imagine standing in front of a closed door, knowing there might be bad news on the other side, but also knowing there's a real chance it's fine. As long as the door stays closed, both possibilities technically still exist. The moment the door opens, one of those possibilities disappears completely. Your brain, in a strange way, finds comfort in that lingering uncertainty. As long as the account stays unchecked, there's still a small protected space where things might be okay. Opening the app collapses that space immediately into one single, confirmed reality. If the news is bad, there's no more room for hopeful uncertainty. The bad news becomes the entire room. This is why avoidance can feel oddly soothing in the short term, even though almost everyone who does it knows, somewhere in the back of their mind, that it isn't actually helping. The brain isn't being irrational here. It's making a very human trade, choosing a smaller, more bearable feeling right now over a potentially sharper, more uncomfortable feeling that knowledge might bring. Layer 2. The gap between shame and money. Here's a layer that explains why this avoidance hits some people much harder than others. For a lot of people, money isn't just math. It's tangled up with identity, self-worth, and how capable they feel as an adult navigating the world. Think about how differently people react to checking the weather versus checking their bank balance. Nobody feels ashamed checking the weather, even if it turns out to be terrible. The number itself carries no judgment. But a low balance, a high credit card statement, an overdue bill, these don't just feel like neutral information to a lot of people. They feel like evidence. Evidence of failure, of not being responsible enough, of somehow falling short of where they're supposed to be by now. Once a number starts to feel like a verdict on someone's character, instead of simply a fact about their finances, avoiding that number starts to make a strange kind of emotional sense. Nobody enjoys voluntarily walking into a room where they expect to be judged, even if the only person doing the judging is themselves. This is why financial avoidance often correlates more strongly with shame and anxiety than it does with the actual size of someone's financial problems. Someone in a genuinely stable financial position can still avoid checking their accounts if money has become tangled up with feelings of inadequacy somewhere along the way. Meanwhile, someone in real financial trouble might check obsessively, simply because their relationship with the number hasn't curdled into shame in the same way. Layer 3. How avoidance quietly makes things worse. Here's the part that makes this pattern genuinely costly, not just emotionally uncomfortable. Avoidance doesn't pause the situation. It just removes your ability to respond to it while it continues moving forward without you. Picture two people, both with a credit card balance slowly growing due to the same minor lifestyle creep. One of them checks the account weekly, notices the trend early, and makes a small adjustment, cutting back slightly, paying a bit more than the minimum, addressing it while the gap is still small and manageable. The other person avoids looking entirely, and months later, opens the app only because a notification finally became impossible to ignore, by which point the balance has grown substantially larger, the interest has compounded further, and the emotional weight of dealing with it has grown right alongside the number. Both people experience the exact same starting situation. The only real difference was when they chose to look. And because avoidance delays that moment, it doesn't just delay discomfort. It often allows the actual underlying problem to grow larger in the meantime, which makes the eventual confrontation even harder than it would have been if they'd looked earlier, when the problem was smaller and more manageable. This creates a particularly cruel cycle. The longer someone avoids checking, the worse the eventual number tends to look, which makes the next instance of checking feel even more frightening, which makes future avoidance even more likely. The behavior that feels protective in the short term actively manufactures more reasons to keep avoiding in the long term. Layer 4. Why looking feels worse than it actually is. Here's something almost nobody tells people directly. The anticipation of checking is almost always more uncomfortable than the actual act of checking itself. This isn't just a comforting platitude. It reflects something real about how anxiety works. When you imagine an unchecked number, your brain doesn't just imagine one specific outcome. It generates a blurry range of worst-case possibilities, and because the brain hasn't pinned down the actual number yet, it tends to default toward the more frightening end of that range. Uncertainty, in this specific context, almost always feels worse than the truth, because uncertainty leaves room for imagination, and imagination, when it comes to money, rarely imagines things going well. The moment an actual number appears on screen, something interesting happens. Even if the number is genuinely bad, it's usually less catastrophic than the vague, anxious blur the brain had been generating in its absence. A real number, however uncomfortable, comes with edges. It's specific. It can be measured, planned around, and addressed. A blurry fear has no edges at all, which makes it almost impossible to actually solve. Here's the deeper idea tying all of this together, and it's the part that genuinely changes how people relate to their own finances once they understand it. Financial avoidance was never really about money. It's about managing an uncomfortable feeling, and the brain, left to its own devices, will often choose to manage that feeling by avoiding the source of information rather than by actually solving the problem underneath it. The behavior makes sense in the moment. It simply doesn't work over time, because the source of discomfort isn't the number. It's the meaning that's been attached to the number. Think of it like a smoke detector that's been muted because the beeping became too stressful to listen to. Muting the alarm genuinely does reduce the immediate stress, but the thing the alarm was warning about doesn't go away just because the sound has been silenced. If anything, removing the warning signal makes the underlying situation more dangerous, not less, because now there's no early signal left to prompt action before things get significantly worse. This is exactly what checking your account is supposed to function as: an early warning system, not a verdict on your worth as a person. The moment a number stops being treated as neutral information and starts being treated as a judgment, the entire warning system breaks down, because nobody wants to keep listening to an alarm that they've come to believe is announcing their failure rather than simply reporting a fact. Here's the genuinely freeing part of this insight. If the discomfort isn't really coming from the number itself, then the number doesn't actually have to be feared in the way it currently is. A balance, a bill, a statement, these are simply pieces of information, exactly as neutral as a weather report, until a person's own internal story turns them into something heavier. Separating the number from the story attached to it is often the single most powerful shift available, because it allows someone to look at their finances the same way they'd look at any other piece of useful information, calmly, clearly, and without treating every glance as an emotional event. So here's what to actually do, practically, if checking your own accounts has become something you quietly dread. First, separate the act of checking from the act of judging. Before opening any banking app, remind yourself explicitly that whatever number appears is simply information, not a verdict. This might sound like a small mental trick, but consciously naming the distinction weakens the emotional charge a number tends to carry, especially over time with repetition. Second, build a regular, low-stakes checking habit instead of relying on willpower in moments of high anxiety. A single, predictable time each week, a specific morning, a specific evening, turns checking into a routine rather than an emotionally loaded event you have to talk yourself into. Routines lower the perceived stakes of any individual action, simply through repetition and familiarity. Third, when you do check, focus on the trend rather than the single number. A single snapshot can feel overwhelming in isolation, but a balance tracked over several weeks tells a much more useful, much less frightening story, because trends reveal direction and progress, while isolated numbers tend to trigger an all-or-nothing emotional reaction. Fourth, remind yourself that a real number is almost always more manageable than the imagined version sitting in the back of your mind. Whenever avoidance starts creeping in, it can help to consciously recall this pattern. The anticipation is doing more damage than the actual information would do, and that recognition alone can be enough to break the avoidance cycle in the moment. Fifth, if shame is the real driver behind the avoidance, address that directly rather than only addressing the spreadsheet. No amount of better budgeting fixes an underlying belief that a low balance makes someone a failure. Sometimes the most useful financial habit isn't a new app or a new system. It's separating self-worth from net worth, clearly and deliberately, so that financial information can finally be treated as exactly what it is, useful data, not a referendum on someone's character. Here's the idea worth sitting with long after this video ends. Avoiding your bank account was never really a financial decision. It was an emotional one, a quiet, understandable attempt to protect yourself from a feeling that felt too heavy to face head-on. The instinct itself isn't a flaw. It's simply your brain doing what brains do, trying to manage discomfort in the fastest available way. But the door you've been avoiding rarely contains the disaster your imagination has been quietly building behind it. More often, it contains a number, specific, manageable, and far easier to deal with than the vague, shapeless dread that's been standing in for it. The fear was doing more work than the truth ever needed to. So the next time your thumb hovers over that banking app for half a second too long, pause for just a moment and ask yourself honestly what you're actually protecting yourself from, the number or the story you've quietly attached to it. Because the people who build real financial security aren't the ones who never feel that hesitation. They're the ones who open the door anyway and find out it was never as dark in there as it felt from the outside.